Okay, so we'll start off with the question and answers. Before I get going on the ones that were already submitted, does anybody have any questions or questions that they want answered before I get going? No? Go for it. Because they were bored. Why does anybody do bad things? Why did you get into that candy that I told you not to? Not that candy. You know the candy I'm talking about. She's like, I have no recollection of this. Okay, all right. First question, why in Acts 16:3 did Paul circumcise Timothy when they were preaching not to, that it was going back to the law? This is a very good question. Actually, I'll make it even more complicated too. He argued very vehemently that Titus not get circumcised at the same time that he did get Timothy circumcised. So kind of an interesting thing there, especially in Galatians. He goes to great lengths to talk about how they shouldn't circumcise because they'd be returning to the law. So why, oh why, did he have Timothy get circumcised? Well, the situation was a little bit different. Paul had Timothy get circumcised in Acts 16:3 because, anybody want to guess? Why? What was the point behind the circumcision? You remember what it says? Anybody? Off the top of your head? No. So the issue was Timothy wasn't circumcised for the sake of fulfilling the law. He was not circumcised for the sake of being saved. He was circumcised because him and Paul were going to be traveling together, and he wanted to make sure that there were no barriers on the way because Timothy's parents, one of them was a Greek and the other one was a Jew. And so there's a little bit of people getting kind of weird about, kind of upset about that. Politics, if you will. And so to just go around the whole issue, Timothy got circumcised. It had to do with their witnessing capabilities, not with salvation. They weren't returning to the law. They were just trying to get ahead of a problem. You know what I mean? But Titus, on the other hand, that wasn't the case. He was a full Greek. His parents were both Greeks. And they were people who were pretending to be the brothers were saying that he needed to be circumcised for the sake of fulfilling the law. And Paul said, no, circumcision is nothing. Just like I was circumcised when I was a baby, that doesn't make me more of a Jew or some nonsense like that. It's just something my parents did, right? It's not to fulfill the law. They did it more for health reasons. But yeah, so good question though. Very good question. If Paul had Timothy get circumcised for the sake of fulfilling the law, then we would have had a problem. But he didn't. And so they were trying to be... And back in the day, now I think this is disgusting, but back in the day they had like Roman bathhouses, so eventually somebody would have seen that Timothy was in fact not circumcised, because it was kind of a communal thing, which is gross to me again, because I'd be like, no, this is my time to get clean. This is not communal time here. But, I guess we're just in a different world now. What is the meaning, the point Jesus is making in Luke 16 through 17? Not sure what is meant by everyone is forcing their way into it, and the least stroke of a pen to drop out of the law. Okay, all right. So I have my Bible here. If you want to read along, you can. We'll start in Luke, and it's actually, this actually happens in Matthew chapter 11 too. 11 as well, not 11 too. Okay, Luke 16 through 17 says, well, I'll start in verse 14. The Pharisees who were lovers of money were listening to all these things and scoffing at him. This is Jesus they were scoffing at. And he told them, you are the ones who justify yourselves in the sight of others, but God knows your hearts. For what is highly admired by people is revolting in God's sight. So here's the setup for this thing that we're about to look at, okay? The Pharisees who are supposed to be the teachers of the law, they're actually very corrupt. They're doing the letter of the law, but they're kind of missing the whole point of it. And so they are loving money. They're loving prestige. And here they are with Jesus, and they're making fun of Jesus while he's trying to teach the people. So this sets up the stage, and Jesus kind of stops what he's talking about to kind of address them. You're the ones who justify yourselves in the sight of others. So they're looking at themselves, saying that they're good and everything. But then he says here, for what is highly admired by people is revolting in God's sight. In other words, people look at you and they are wowed by you. However, God is not wowed by you. So then we get to verse 16. It says, the law and the prophets were until John. Now, let me just read through this, and I'll go back and explain. Since then, the good news of the kingdom of God has been proclaimed, and this is how the CSB says it, and everyone is urgently invited to enter it. NIV might read something similar, but KJV and ASB, they're going to say something along the lines of, well, actually, probably something around everyone's forcing their way into it. Probably something along the line of that. Okay, and then it goes on in verse 17. But it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one stroke of a letter in the law to drop out. Okay, everyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery, and everyone who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. So what's going on there? Why does he even say the thing about adultery? What is going on? Okay, so let's take it little bit by little bit. Verse 16 says, the law and the prophets were until John. So this is what he's saying here is there's these two periods of time. There's from the prophets and the law up until John's death, John the Baptist's death, and then there's after that. So the first epoch, if you want to say, is the prophet and law. The second is the kingdom. So let's see, 16. The law and the prophets were until John, but since that epoch, since that age has ended, since then the good news of the kingdom of God has been proclaimed. And I really do think that this is a better reading how the CSB words it. And everyone is urgently invited to enter it. Here's the issue. Translation. So I don't want to get into this because this is second year Greek, and so we'd have to very quickly summarize 2 years of Greek, and we're not going to do that. Long story short, is it translated as a passive or as a middle? And really, it could be either. It's the exact same structure. It's just how you would translate it. So if it's translated as a middle, it would be everyone is forcing their way into it. But if it's translated as a passive, which is how I think it should be, it would be everyone is urgently is invited urgently to enter it. And the main point that he's making here is the kingdom is going very rapidly. Time is short. People are being urged to enter in while this is going on. And then he gets to verse 17, which kind of clarifies what he's talking about here. Is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one stroke of a letter in the law to drop out. And there's two main points here that he's making. First off, it's very difficult for people to leave the old covenant and transfer to the new covenant. Very difficult. It's difficult nowadays. People still are trying to live by the Old Testament law and then still be a Christian, and there's just a lot of confusion there. And also, at this time, it was very difficult because they were Jews, and so now you're asking us to convert everything that's in our history to just skip over. Kind of a little bit rough there. The second thing that it's saying here, let's see here. The good news of the kingdom of God has been proclaimed, and everyone is urgently invited to enter it, the kingdom. But it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one stroke of a letter. The second point he's trying to make here is the law and the prophets have been fulfilled with Jesus, but the morality didn't go away. In other words, just because you're seeing the kingdom go forward does not mean that morality has somehow ceased. Okay? So then he goes on to say, everyone who divorces his wife and marries another. This is a metaphor. The reason why he's bringing it up here is because the divorce is kind of like the covenant, right? You're divorcing one covenant and marrying to another one. It kind of seems like that. So he's using this as a way to say two different things. First off, the law still shows us morality, and the second thing that, yes, there is kind of a divorce of sorts going between the two. And so you have this kind of a tense situation he's going to, and then he goes straight into the proverb that says, there was a rich man who would dress in purple and fine linen. So before we go to kind of summarizing that, let's look at Matthew 11 and see, because it says the same event, but it words it differently. So in Matthew 11, starting in verse probably 11 maybe. Let's see. Matthew 11, starting in verse, let's go 11. Truly I tell you, among those born of women, no one greater than John the Baptist has appeared. But the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been suffering violence, and the violent men have been seizing it by force. So what does that mean? So let's keep going here. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. So you can see the basic content still there. It's just a little bit reworded. So let's kind of work through it. In verse 1, he says about how, John the Baptist, the great messenger, but yet the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. And it goes to verse 12 and says, from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has been suffering violence. Now, I think in this case, the CSB gets it definitely wrong. I would argue that it should be translated more, the kingdom of heaven has been forcefully advancing, which carries the same idea as it did in Luke. But here, the emphasis is different in how that applies. And violent men have been seizing it by force. So whereas the kingdom of heaven has been advancing forcefully, it's going ahead and plowing through things, breaking through family ties and all the culture. It's really plowing through. At the same time, violent men are attacking it. At point in case, John the Baptist was beheaded by one of these violent men. So I mean, we're talking about John the Baptist, and what better opportunity there is to show that yes, the kingdom of heaven is advancing, but there is a lot of people not agreeing with it, conflict, tension, not getting along. The kingdom of heaven has been suffering violence, or has been advancing violently once again, whether it's translated as a passive or a middle. And the violent have been seizing it by force. Then he goes on to verse 13 to basically say the same thing he said in Luke. For all the prophets in the law prophesied until the time of John, right? And if you're willing to accept it, he is Elijah to come. And he goes on from there to talk about something else. Now, if you notice, the context that is quoted in is different. Neither Luke nor, well, maybe more Luke, but Matthew definitely is not concerned with trying to record everything chronologically speaking. He's trying to more do something with themes. Luke did more chronologically, but also not really. See, most of the Gospels aren't trying to lay down a bare history. They're trying to teach something with the history. So they're going to say things in different orders, and they're kind of going to change how the wording is. But it's the same event. They're just emphasizing different things. In Luke, he's emphasizing the way that the kingdom is going forward. It's now to enter. But in Matthew, he's emphasizing the way that the kingdom of God is going forward, and there's going to be conflict. So two different themes, same story. So what is the meaning, the point? I just said that. Not sure what is meant by everyone is forced their way into it. Well, in Luke, that would be a mistranslation. It's more of everyone is urgently invited to enter while the time is still going on. And in Matthew, it would be the violent are attacking it. And the least stroke of a pen to drop out of the law, I said that about the way that people were having a hard time switching over. And also, the change of the ages doesn't mean that the morality had somehow gone away. So, any questions on either of those before we head on to the third? No? Okay. Third question, Mark 3:31 through 35. Were Jesus' brothers and sisters / mother not saved? These verses confuse me. This is a very interesting thing that actually one of the Gospels, I believe, says very specifically that Paul and Jesus' brothers did not believe at that time. So I want to say it was John, but I don't really remember. I just remember reading through, and I was like, oh, yeah. But I probably should have looked some of these things up, huh? But okay. So he says there about how Jesus' brothers were not saved at that time. Now his mother is a different issue because we really don't know one way or another. We know that the dad probably dies sometime before Jesus starts his public ministry for the sole reason that he's out and about, meaning that he's not under his father's house anymore. And also when he is dying, he says about how he hands his mother off to John. Why would he do that if the father was still alive? But being the older brother, he would be responsible for taking care of the mother, so it would make sense that he'd hand her off to someone else because he was dying. So that argues strongly that Jesus' dad is dead. Now, we don't really have much to go on with Jesus' dad. We just know that he listened to the angel about trusting Mary, which there's a lot of funny clips. I'm getting sidetracked. We know that he took that step of faith, so he was, a believer of some point, and I don't know how far that went. I don't know when he died, or I don't know. So then the mother, it says that his mother, that she remembered all these things in her heart, but that could mean a couple different things. I personally think she probably was a believer pretty early on. First off, because she's a mom, right? Moms typically believe in you pretty early on. But then second off, she probably remembered having a baby without having sex. So she was probably like, yeah, that's probably the Christ. You know what I mean? There's that song, Mary, Did You Know? And yeah, she did, because the angel told her from day one. So I find it hard to believe that Mary did not believe until later. I could just be reading into that. But the brothers did not. They were not believers. In fact, the Bible goes out of its way to explain that after the fact, Jesus had to make a special appearance to James, and I want to say maybe Jude, basically to convert them, to sway them over. They were not followers of him in his earthly ministry in his earthly time. So, yes, they overlooked it. However, I do want to mention something about this. This story, Mark 3:31, that is where he's in like the house, and the people say, "Hey, your mom and your brothers are outside," right? And he says, "Who's my mother and my brothers?" And he notices he doesn't say, "Who's my father?" because he's setting up the whole idea of the church family, but the Father is obviously God the Father, so he didn't say that. But anyways, and he says, "Who is my mother and my brother?" It's those who do the will of God. So his point there is not disowning his mother and his brothers. His point there is rather in establishing the idea of the church, the church family. So next one. Can you be content in this life? Ooh, that's a little bit of an up and a yes. Yes and a no. I would say yes and no. You cannot be content with this life. Like, this life is never going to satisfy you. However, you can find contentment in your life. Like, for instance, when you seek God and you trust Him, you can be content with what He's given you, and you can be content with that. But life itself is never going to satisfy you. You're always going to be looking for more. So I would say that's a yes and a no. Obviously, Paul found contentment. No. Obviously, Paul found contentment, and so, it's possible. Okay. So, and were there any other questions or things that I answered that maybe weren't clear? You guys thought of a different question while I was talking? Anything? No? Okay. Well, if you think of something, just kind of wave me down. So last question and answer, which was probably 2 months ago, I started talking very briefly about the God of the gaps. And as luck would have it, this last week I was watching a documentary, and it was talking about this certain bird. I don't remember what the bird was. It was in Australia, okay? The land down under. And in this magical kingdom that is upside down, they have this bird that is able to find its way to this place, and scientists have no idea how it's able to do this. So I was watching this documentary, and they were talking about, well, this amazing bird, it's able to do this, and scientists have no idea how it's able to do this. And I was thinking about how an easy answer to say is, well, that's God. But see, that's the argument of the God of the gaps. Basically, it goes like this. Well, basically, I don't understand, therefore it's God. But when I understand, that's not God. That's the God of the gaps. This is an inherently flawed view that, unfortunately, it's too easy to pass it off to that, right? So, I don't know how this works. It must be God, right? And I'm not saying it's not God, but I'm saying God uses processes, and when you just simply say it's God, what happens in your head is as soon as you have an answer, God's irrelevant now. I have my answer now. Okay, so it looks something like this, okay? The God of the gaps works until you find an answer, and so the problem is that God is responsible for what I don't understand and nothing else. God is only necessary if I don't know what caused the thing. So once I do know, I don't need God. I don't need God. I have an explanation. Let's say, for instance, and then this kind of clarifies, and I'll use two examples. Let's say later on we find out that this bird, this magical Australian bird that is able to do this thing by pressure in the air or some satanic witchcraft like that, okay? It's just this magical thing that's able to do. Well, see, that doesn't mean that God didn't do it. Rather, what it means is, isn't it amazing what God created? And I'll use a different example. Let's say evolution actually turns out to be true, which is so improbable, scientifically speaking and religiously speaking and just common sense speaking, and so probably did not happen, right? But let's just say the evolution did happen. That would be another example of, okay, so God definitely had to have been the one behind that because it's so improbable that it happened. You see what I'm saying? Evolution happening doesn't mean that God didn't do it. Rather, it means, isn't it amazing that God was able to use such slim odds to actually accomplish something? I mean, it's just statistically almost impossible that evolution is real. And so the God of the gaps misses the whole point, and that being that it's not God if I don't understand it. It's God anyways, and He uses the systems that He created, right? So, lava, isn't that amazing? Yeah, because God made it like that. It's not amazing just because I don't know how lava works. It's amazing because I do know how lava works, and God made it. You see what I mean? then I'll just leave it at that. But people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, which we're going to watch a clip here, argue against Christianity because of people making arguments about God of the gaps. And it's something that's not really a good argument. So let's go ahead and watch the clip. Okay, so two things we're going to talk about very briefly. I hope very briefly. We're going to talk about the idea of hyper-skepticism, and I'm going to very briefly, 4 points that I want to make in rebuttal to what he's saying. The first thing is, if you do a simple Google search, just faith definition, okay? The Oxford Languages shows up the very first definition of faith, confidence in a person or thing. Confidence in a person or thing. It's basically what you trust. Now, he described faith as something that you believe in the absence of evidence, right? You just make something up, right? So into this definition, which I did not cherry pick, I just typed it into Google, faith definition. This was the very first definition that popped up from Oxford Languages. So technically speaking, that confidence in a person or a thing, that doesn't have to be God. It could be God, but it could also be science, right? It could be intelligence. It could be money or health. There's many different things you can have faith in. Many different things. That's the first little point I want to make here. So faith is not as he defined it. Second thing is faith can be based on actual or supposed evidence. And there's a big difference here. Supposed evidence is evidence that you believe to be impactful because it's impactful to you, but it's not actual significant proof. Okay, like a lot of times people say, "What's that song? You ask me how I know he lives inside my heart." Remember that song? Well, that's cute and everything, but it's not really an answer to the problem of faith, is it? Right? It's not really like, I just kind of woke up and believe. Well, that's good. You know, it's fine to believe, but the thing is, people say that same thing with Buddha too. I believe in my heart. You know, it's like, well, okay. You kind of get what I'm saying? Like, it's not really a strong argument for it, but it's a strong argument for the person who wrote the song. So, I mean, that would be supposed evidence. Then there's actual evidence. Actual evidence would be something more like data, something that you could actually present to argue a case. So faith can be based on these evidences, which would include feelings, data, experience, and sometimes, as I think he was implying here, I don't think he actually said it, but I think he was implying it, fear. I'm afraid of dying, therefore I need religion as a crutch to help me with my fear. I think that's what he was kind of implying there. But so it can be based off that. The third thing I want to point out is he said, did you guys catch the part where he said, I look to the universe to see the God that's described, and I don't see it. There's no evidence for this God that they're talking about. Did you guys remember him saying that? Okay, well, there's a few things about that. Like, when people say this, I genuinely am puzzled. It's like, are you just not thinking, or are you just not researching, or how do you arrive at such a fact conclusion when? Are you sure? Like, just a few things I wrote down here. Jesus fulfilled prophecy in his birth, life, and death. Take out the life bit, okay? Just his birth and his death. How in the world are you going to fulfill prophecy with your birth and your death? You're not in control of those things. Like, you can't like pick your perfect family to be born into, right? Like, you can't do that. Yet Jesus fulfilled hundreds of prophecies with his birth, life, and his death. And he didn't not fulfill any of the prophecies about him. The only ones that are not fulfilled to this point are the ones that are still to come. It's not like, if you guys have ever read the science fiction masterwork, Dune. It's not like that, right? Because in that book, the main, he's not really the hero. He's more of a tainted messiah figure, like a dark character. Everybody thinks he's the hero, but he's not. He's like the anti-hero. Paul Atreides, he uses the prophecies and all these different things from moral chaos and to manipulate poor, ignorant folk. Well, that's not what we see with Jesus at all, right? We don't see him manipulating the masses. We see him loving and serving and dying for them. I mean, then you look at the content of his teachings. It wasn't like something crazy off the wall. Like, he wasn't like making crazy things up. If you've ever read the Gnostic Gospels, that's crazy. Like, that's somebody was high when they wrote that book. But when you hear the things that Jesus said, which is actually older than any of the Gnostic books anyways, you don't see him saying those kind of crazy things. Then you see the simple fact that Jesus' tomb is empty. So what happened to the body? You can't simply say, oh, he didn't exist, because like, historically speaking, not religion, not bias, historically speaking, you can't simply say Jesus didn't exist. That would be like saying Caesar didn't exist, or Alexander the Great didn't exist. That just, it's nonsense. You can't realistically call yourself a historian and just deny that Jesus ever existed. That's just stupid. So he did exist. What happened to the tomb? The Romans wouldn't have cared enough to take the body. They wouldn't have. I mean, I think the earliest reference that the Romans make of Jesus is like 125 AD or something. It's something like that. Like after the church has already gotten up steam, they wouldn't have cared enough to take the body. Well, maybe the Jews took the body. If the Jews took the body, why wouldn't they just produce it when the church gained momentum? Hey, you know that guy that you're saying rose from the dead? Well, here's his body, right? I mean, wouldn't that kind of squash the whole revolt? But they didn't, because they didn't have the body. Let's see what else. So then, why? Then the only other person who could have taken Jesus' body would be the Christians themselves. But let's think about that. People die for things that they believe in all the time, huh? Muslims do this. Patriots do this. I mean, people die for things that they believe in all the time. But nobody ever dies for something that they know is a lie, do they? So you're saying that they took the body and then died knowing that they were the ones who had the body the whole time? What? That's crazy wild. Like that's pretty far-fetched. And I don't think that really goes with facts. And then there's other evidences that kind of fit, but I'm not going to get into that. And it kind of all fits together. But it's those evidences that spawn the faith. And so then all the other things fit into that faith, the science and all that stuff. Okay. But it's based on something that is facts, right? These prophecies that were fulfilled, that's facts. The body is missing. That's fact. I don't just believe in something because I woke up and decided to believe in something. There is evidence for it. The Bible is well attested. So let's keep going. Then there's obviously the arguments from nature, things like morality, our own reasoning that there has to be a God. You know, it blows me away that people say, prove that there's a God. People have just known that there's a God for, countless thousands and thousands of years, but now all of a sudden we have to prove that there's a God. Like, why should we start with a negative assumption that there isn't a God? That doesn't make sense to me. But, I mean, I guess everybody's to their own. C.S. Lewis actually argued that pain itself is an argument for God's existence. So let's get a little more specific. He said he looked to the universe, and he didn't find evidence. So this is an impossible thing that he's asking, isn't it? He's saying he looked to the created universe looking for God, and he doesn't find anything in a created universe that could be God. Yes, that's exactly the problem, because you can't find a eternal God in a temporary space, can you? Everything that you can find out there with a telescope is going to be something that was created and has age to it, right? Time, it's going to be confined to the idea of time. So he's looking in the wrong place. If you guys ever seen Indiana Jones, they're digging in the wrong place. No? Oh, okay, all right, that's fine. But when you look at the idea of the Big Bang, which, I mean, every scientist believes in the Big Bang, everybody. So let's take the idea of the Big Bang. Whatever caused the Big Bang, there's two possible causes. Nothing became everything. Okay, by definition, that's nonsense. Or God created it. Okay, well, that fits because that would be something that's outside of time and space. Okay, so whatever caused the Big Bang, it had to be very powerful to create everything. It had to be beyond space and time, beyond the physical universe, beyond age, right? Because everything in the universe, it's expanding very rapidly. It has time, everything. We can always date everything because it's confined to time. So whatever created the Big Bang had to be outside of time. And it had to be intelligent because you get things like DNA. DNA is an intelligible code written inside of all all life. So it had to be something intelligent to create that. There's order and law to the creation. So it had to be something that was intelligent. It had to be personal. So he says that he didn't find anything, but I say the exact opposite. There's nothing but proof in the created order that there had to have been something behind it. I mean, I know this is a cliche, but how many times have you walked up to a house and said, wow, that's amazing that the house just suddenly appeared out of absolutely nothing? If that continued to happen, do you know how frightful of a universe we would live in? Like just things coming into existence all the time, you get squashed like that. And that's how the dinosaurs died. Some house materialized and crushed them. So what about, then people would say, well, what about the problems of disorder and chaos and pain and sickness? That's way too much to talk about tonight, but I would once again refer you to C.S. Lewis's Problem of Pain and just kind of leave it off there. Now, the atheist is a very interesting thing, because basically, to be an atheist, what you say is you have examined all religions and all the evidence for the different religions, and you've come to the careful conclusion that God does not exist. It's all wrong. But what you're seeing nowadays, you're seeing a lot of people say that they're atheists when they haven't done any of the legwork of analyzing anything. They just, that's stupid. The Bible's stupid. Okay, why is it stupid? Well, because it's full of contradictions. Okay, where's the contradiction? Let's talk about it. Let's see. And there's no conversation. It's just, oh, well, you're just religious nut jobs. It's like, well, this is going to become more common. And the thing is, we're not going to see people saved in the same ways as we saw them saved 50 years ago. Back then, you could refer to people like to biblical events like, hey, the flood, and people would say, oh yeah, Noah, even if they didn't go to church, because everybody knew something, right? We're coming to what's called a post-Christian society. People aren't even aware of these stories anymore. It's not uncommon to be talking to teenagers, for instance, here, and say, hey, David and Goliath, and they'll say, who? You know, with the giant and the rock and the who? You know, we're a post-Christian culture now. We're not going to see it in the same way. A lot of it's going to come through dialogue. Like Paul and them had to do. So, anyways, moving on to this. What else to say? But ridiculing someone alone for their beliefs is stupid, and just hopping on the bandwagon of, well, everybody's making fun of religious people. That's just as stupid. The fourth thing I want to mention. So the fourth thing is, he said at the very end, he said, it shouldn't matter what I believe. Do you guys remember when he said that? It shouldn't matter what I believe is what he said. Well, I would argue that it definitely does matter what you believe, primarily because of bias. Everybody has bias. There's no such thing as having objective belief. Not even if you have just plain facts, you're going to interpret it differently based on your bias. There is no such thing as completely objective analysis. It does not exist. And that's not something I'm just throwing out there. A lot of philosophers way smarter than me have gone around in circles only to come to the exact same conclusion. Yes, objective reality does not exist. It's impossible. So, yes, it absolutely does matter what he believes. It's going to taint everything he sees. Belief governs your views, your actions, your thoughts, and your lifestyle. And the last thing I want to mention before we go on to the game is something called hyperskepticism. I don't know if that's actually what it's called. That's what I call it. So skepticism is good, right? Skepticism basically says, I have a couple questions about that. If it wasn't for skepticism, everybody would have drank the Kool-Aid, and there would be nothing else except for a bunch of dead people drinking Kool-Aid, right? I mean, it's good. Skepticism is good. And even in the story of doubting Thomas, the issue wasn't that Thomas didn't believe. That's not the takeaway from that, okay? Thomas had the evidence of the empty tomb, eyewitnesses telling him what happened, right? Numerous eyewitnesses. And then he still said no, even after he'd walked with Jesus and Jesus told him in advance what would happen. Even after all those evidences, then he doubted and said, no, unless I touch Jesus myself. That was the issue. It wasn't that Thomas was a skeptic. Skepticism is good. You shouldn't just believe whatever somebody says. Absolutely. But there was extenuating circumstances that was a good reason to believe this. And so Jesus said, hey, you believe because you've been able to. What about us now? We have a lot of the same evidences that Thomas did. So going to this idea of hyperskepticism is bad because no amount of evidence is ever enough with hyperskepticism. It doesn't matter how many questions you ask or what, they've already made up their mind what to believe. It's like when somebody comes to me and says, me and my spouse are having problems, we need counseling. Okay, great, let's talk about it. Let's all three of us meet and we'll talk, okay? And then only one of them shows up and you're like, okay, this is seeming a little hunky, and you're like, what's going on there? And they're like, well, my husband didn't want to come. Of course. It's like, of course. Why? What am I missing here? And then long story short, they just want you to say, yes, your husband is a dirtbag. You should divorce him. It's like, oh, you didn't actually want to get help for your marriage. You wanted me to join you and why your husband is the worst person in the world. Okay, that's exactly what hyperskepticism it does. It doesn't actually look for the truth. It just looks for, justification for my lack of belief. It's not rational. It's very biased. And it starts from an idea that it is more intelligent to instantly disbelieve any spiritual or experience or religion. Who decided that? Who decided we have to start with the negative idea of these things can't be proved. It can't be believed. Especially when you look at the idea that science itself can't prove that truth even exists. The entire idea of science is built on a house of cards. Have you guys ever thought about this? Science is based on the assumption that truth exists. But you cannot test truth scientifically. You have to just go on the assumption that it exists to do science. So you want to just skip over that huge problem and then say, but you have to start out from a completely scientific pattern. Well, if I have to start out with completely scientific pattern, I can't really start off with science then, can I? Because science can't prove truth. You get what I'm saying? It's a, I don't know what the term is for it. Not a catch-22, but I don't know what it would be. Anyways, so oftentimes what happens, and I think, and I already pointed out how I think Tyson did this, is people will demand impossible evidence because of hyperskepticism, evidence that could not exist. I'll give you 3 examples. Well, if God is all-powerful, then he needs to make 3 plus 3 equal 2. God cannot make an impossible thing happen. He's all-powerful. He's not all-nonsensical. There's a big difference. So, no, God cannot do that. He can't be nonsensical. The second example. Well, God the Father has to appear before me if for me to believe. Well, first off, that would make you God because you're bossing God around. That's the first problem. And the second problem, no one has seen God the Father and lived, so you would actually probably die, in which case you couldn't have your argument there. And then the third example I can think of, I have to witness an encounter of God personally. It sounds like a good argument, but think about this. Who here, by show of hands, believes that the earth has a core? You believe in the earth's core? Okay. Everybody raise their hand. Have you seen the earth's core? No? Well, why do you believe it? And that's the exact same argument. I mean, the exact same thing. It's a complete nonsense, right? So I'm not going to believe in God unless I personally encounter this thing. But you believe in the earth's core and you haven't personally encountered it. That doesn't fit. It doesn't fit. You don't have to personally experience every single thing for it to be true or not true. And this is we're going to go to the game now. You can never be 100% sure of anything in life. Everything is done by a series of probabilities. Everything in life. You do not have complete 100% proof that God the Father exists as you see him. You don't have any proof. You can't produce him. There is an element of faith until the day that you die. But neither does the atheist have complete 100% proof that he doesn't exist. There's always an element of faith in any belief system. There's always an element of faith. You cannot make 100% sure of anything. It's a law of probabilities. You look at the evidence, you come to an informed conclusion. I have looked at the evidence, I have come to the informed conclusion that God does exist. And I have also experienced him in my life, and I've also encountered him and felt him. But I don't believe in him because I felt him. I believe in him because of the evidence that speaks for it. And because I believed, I encountered. There's a process there. And so we all have bias. We have to be aware of it, and we have to engage in a dialogue. Now, this is a good thing because as Christians, we come to believe things. We as we're talking to people and trying to witness to them, we also grow in our faith. But when we don't witness to people and we don't have those dialogues, our faith kind of shrinks and diminishes. And we say, well, I don't want to witness because I'm scared to. That's understandable. But that's one of those things that doesn't go away unless you do start witnessing and having those conversations with people. It's a very irritating part of life, but that's just kind of the way it works. So any questions that I didn't answer very good? Any other questions you guys thought of? Anything?